Hey everybody, thanks for clicking on this video. Today we're going to be working on solving trigonometric equations with different trig functions. If you want to follow along, the links to the companion worksheet are in the description below. Also, don't forget to click that subscribe button so you can stay up to date on all the videos that we have coming out from the channel. So, let's get started. So with this equation, unlike the previous video where we had just one trig function equal to a number, here we have cosine and sine together. How do we handle this? Well, one thing that both of these two terms have in common is that they both have cosine. So what we can do is we can factor cosine of x out. And so if we factor cosine of x out of this term, we're left with sine of x. And if we factor cosine of x out of this, we're left with minus 1/2. Now all of this is still equal to 0. And so if we know that we have two things multiplied together and equal 0, that means one of them, or maybe both, are equal to 0. So that means we set cosine of x equal to 0, and we set sine of x minus 1/2, that whole quantity, equal to 0. Now over here we can solve by adding 1/2 onto both sides. So sine of x equals 1/2. And then using our unit circle, we can find when is cosine 0. Well, cosine is 0 at 90 degrees and at 270 degrees. And sine is 1/2 at 30 degrees and 150 degrees. Now, oftentimes books will want you to put all your angles together in a single expression, kind of like this. And so if that's true, then here's how you would write it. 30 degrees, 90 degrees, 150 degrees, 270 degrees, because they want you to put them all in numerical order. So if your teacher or your homework requires you to do that, this is what it would look like. Notice that in this problem, we are using degrees, because the problem says that x is between 0 and 360 degrees. So it's important to make that note. For the second one, here, these two expressions, they're on the opposite sides of the equal sign. So what we first want to do is we first want to get sine onto the left side of the equal sign. So we have 2 times quantity sine of x times the quantity cosine of x minus sine of x equals 0. And then from this, we look at these two terms and we say, what can we factor out? Well, we can factor out sine of x. And so when we factor sine x out of this, we're left with 2 cosine of x. When we factor sine of x out of this, remember that factoring means divide. A lot of people, they think there's nothing. Well, no. We're dividing out sine, and that means we're left with 1. So now, these two quantities multiply to equal 0. So that means sine of x by itself could equal 0, or minus 2 cosine of x minus 1. That could equal 0. So we add 1 to both sides. So we have 2 cosine of x equals 1, and then we divide by 2. So cosine of x equals 1/2. So now going to our unit circle, we look at where is sine, that is the y value, 0, and that happens at 0 degrees and 180 degrees. And then we look for where cosine of x, that is the x value, equals 1/2. So that is at 60 degrees and 300 degrees. So written all together, this would be 0 degrees, comma, 60 degrees, comma, 180 degrees, comma, and then 300 degrees. All 4 of those together in a single set. All right. Now on the next page, here we have 3 completely different trig functions, tangent, sine, and secant. And there's nothing they seem to have in common. But what I would suggest you do is rewrite tangent and secant in terms of sine and cosine. So tangent is sine of theta over cosine of theta. Now sine we don't need to rewrite. And then secant is 1 over cosine of theta. Now these two we can multiply because sine over cosine times sine, or sine over 1. And this is going to become sine squared of theta over cosine of theta minus 1 over cosine of theta equals 0. Now since we're subtracting these two fractions, we have to have a common denominator, and we do, which means we can write this as sine squared theta minus 1 over cosine of theta equals 0. Now if we have two quantities that we're dividing and that equals 0, what that means is that the top quantity has to equal 0. So sine squared of theta minus 1 equals 0. So we add 1, and that means we have sine squared of theta equals 1. So when we take the square root, that means sine of theta equals plus or minus 1. Because if sine squared to begin with was 1, that means it could have been plus 1. If you square that, you get 1. But if you square negative 1, you also get 1. Now that means our angle, looking at our unit circle, could be either 90 degrees or 270 degrees. But that's not the end of the problem. The thing to note is that we have this cosine in the denominator. And the rule of fractions is that you can never divide by 0. So that means cosine of theta cannot equal 0. Which means then any angle where cosine is 0 is not allowed to happen. So where is that? Well, where's cosine 0? Well, the x value is being 0 happens at 90 degrees and 270 degrees. And so what happens is this negates the answers we just found. Those can't happen because what ends up happening is we end up dividing by 0. So that means for this problem, there's actually no solution. The answers we found turned out to not work. All right. Now for this last one, we need to do the same thing as we did up in number 3, and that is we need to first rewrite the problem in terms of just sine and cosine. So cotangent is cosine over sine. Now, next we need to subtract over onto one side so that one side equals 0. So we'll take cosine cubed of theta over sine minus, theta, minus cosine of theta over sine of theta, and that all equals 0. Remember, all these problems work on the idea that we can factor things out, and factoring only works when it's equal to 0. No other number works for factoring. Since they have the same denominator, we can combine them. So cosine cubed of theta minus cosine of theta all over sine of theta equals 0. Now, like number 3, when we divide two quantities and get 0, that means the top had to be 0. So cosine cubed of theta minus cosine of theta equals 0. Now, what do these have in common? They both have a cosine, so we can factor out cosine of theta. And we have cosine squared theta minus 1, and that equals 0. And so that means, since they're factored and it's equal to 0, that means cosine of theta equals 0, and cosine squared of theta minus 1 equals 0. So if I add 1 to both sides, I get cosine squared theta equals 1. And then we can take the square root. So cosine of theta equals plus or minus 1. So now, looking at our unit circle, we ask, where is cosine 0? And since we're in radians, we should say pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2. And where's cosine 1 or negative 1? At 0 and at pi. But, lest we forget the last problem, we still have sine in the denominator. So sine is not allowed to equal 0. We can never divide by 0. So where does that happen? Well, that happens, if we look on our unit circle, where the y value is 0, that happens at 0 and at pi. So that crosses off these two answers. But it still leaves these. So unlike number 3, this does have solutions at pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2. Those are our two answers for this problem. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up. For more videos like this, click the subscribe button. If you have suggestions or problems you want to see worked out, type a comment below. To support the channel, click the Patreon link to help keep this going. Thanks so much for watching, and remember, the best way to understand something is to do it.